Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. I have a bit of a loud voice anyway. Just very quickly, I've been coming to Fiji since 2001, and some of my clients have included FEA, TFL, LTA, Osana. It's about 20 odd different organisations. And I'm just finishing a month working with the Public Service Commission via a contract with the University of South Pacific one. So, and that's all around change. That's just a bit more background on myself and the organisation. Before coming here this time, I spent a week in Papua New Guinea and then a week in Solomon Islands beforehand. So getting to know the Pacific quite well. I think I had 5 trips to PNG last year. Okay, there's some of the different organisations worked with in the Pacific area. After working with the Public Service Commission and the different ministries there, I've got to at the director level. I've got a few more to that, I think. This is my understanding what we're going to cover. What is organisational culture? What do cultures do? How do creating and sustaining a culture? How do employees learn culture? Creating a positive organisational culture, and the emerging importance of soft skills. And just on that latter one, I mean, you don't realise one of the big advantages you have compared to us Westerners. You very much are into what we call the we culture, much more community focused. We in the West are still very much in the I, me. And the evidence now is that really that we culture is very, very more and more important. And I think Obama was probably the first leader at a national or international level to represent that. If you think of his background, he didn't really come from the corporate world. He came from a bit more of a community-orientated world and lived in places like Indonesia, etc. And it's quite an amazing story when you think about it. If you laid bets 10 years ago that said he'd be president for 2 terms, I think he'd be a very wealthy man now with the odds and so on. But he came from a very different and unusual background to become president of the United States with a second name, Muslim Hassan. Brought up, he actually went to a Muslim school in Indonesia. So I'm brought up by an Indonesian stepfather, Kenyan father. So all those things really don't add up to what you regard typically to be president of the United States. And maybe it's this is me just thinking out loud. It's a bit of a paradigm shift going on, etc. So don't underestimate your understanding of the community side and therefore the soft skills is much better than us Westerners. Okay, so just to get the things going, this is a exercise on how good are you at insights. And to be good at insights, your brain has to be very relaxed. If it's very busy, you won't have an insight. Too many electrical impulses going through it. So can you answer those questions for me? What gets wetter the more it dries? What's the reward for waiting? What do you put inside a barrel to make it lighter? And what place does Thursday precede Wednesday? What eats but never swallows? Insights come to you very quickly. If you have to go through a rational process, you're not having an insight. You most likely won't get the answers to this. So, and this is why maybe just a glass of alcohol or a cup of carb is enough to help you relax and get the insight, but 2 or 3 cups, you're probably going to getting too relaxed. Looks like it might be too late in the afternoon. You can talk amongst yourselves. It doesn't have to be an individual exercise. You can... Punch. That's which one's that one?
The first one.
No, I think you're on a different wavelength there. You must have had too much carb last year. You're too relaxed, I think. You might have seen another crossword I put up, which the answer is punch. So I thought maybe you've seen that one. And I haven't got that one tonight. Anybody got any ideas? What gets wetter the more it dries? Any suggestions, any thoughts? A towel? Yep. Towel, sponge. Okay. What's the reward for waiting? Prince Charming? You've been watching too many Hollywood and Bollywood movies, I think. What's the reward for waiting? A tip or patience? Okay. What can you put inside a barrel to make it lighter? Air? They won't make it lighter, they'll make it the same. Holes, drill holes. Okay? In what place does Thursday precede Wednesday?
Dictionary.
Dictionary, correct, in alphabetical order. Okay, somebody go. I actually told him the answer to that one before. No. What eats but never swallows?
Acid. Acid.
Acid, yeah, that's another one too. Rust. Okay, so those answers are a bit different, and the only way you can find them is what they sometimes call intuitive thinking, which is meaning you just got to be, and the evidence now looking at the brain, to have an insight, you've got to be very relaxed. If you're all hyped up, you won't have insights. And a lot of change these days is thinking differently and having those insights. If you had to go through a rational process, that's not an insight. Okay. So there's some nice quotes. We always like these quotes. Edgar Sheen's written a lot on change management. It's more or less saying we don't know what tomorrow's going to be like, except we know it's going to be different. And therefore it's very hard to prepare for it's going to be different. Charles Darwin, I think you've probably all heard of him. And that still applies today. Just because you're the strongest of the species, the most intelligent, doesn't mean you're going to survive. It's one of the most adaptable to change. That's from Jack Walsh, who was the successful CEO of GE. I think if you purchased something like $10,000 worth of shares when he became CEO, and I think about 20 years later when he finished, it would be worth about $300,000. He demonstrated how you can make a traditional hierarchical organisation, you could change it. And normally people don't think you can change those. But he demonstrated that you could do it. It's interesting that when he had his second divorce, his whole reputation got tainted because all the evidence came out of what he was getting on the side, etc., etc. That one is an interesting one. That's a real voyage of discovery. If you remember when NASA first got going, they had a challenge, had to find a way to get a biro to work in zero gravity. And they ended up with a complicated pressurised nitrogen bit of instrument. What did the Russians use? Pencil, slate. So where is your mindset? Quite often the answer is in front of you, but you're in the wrong mindset. And if you just think in the 1980s, all these sort of forecast gurus were saying Japan is going to be the next superpower. In the 1990s, they talked about the 4 or 5 tigers around Asia: Korea, Singapore, Thailand, Taiwan, and maybe Indonesia. No one talked of China. No one talked of India. They all said there were too many people. So be careful of the experts in the wrong paradigm. Peter Drucker, he was sort of the management consultant guru. He lived well into his mid-90s, wrote a lot of very powerful stuff around management and so forth. So he's more or less saying you've got to get ready for change. And when you get a man in his 90s saying that, that's quite interesting. Okay, Harvard Business Review, you're probably familiar with, is probably the #1 management publication. Handling that ripple effect is one of the challenges of change. Like it's like throwing a stone into a pond. You get that ripple effect. If you change things in Nandi, it's going to affect Suva, and vice versa. And that's one of the challenges of change, handling those unexpected ripples. You have to be flexible enough to handle them. If you get too rigid, you'll have a problem. Michael Chaney is a very successful Australian businessman. He's actually got a better record than Jack Welch. If you invested $8,000 in his company, and 20 years later when he finished as CEO and you reinvested all the dividends, you'll be a millionaire. And so on. He's quite a incredible guy. But he's now the chairman, I think, of NAB Bank, but he was West Farmers of the organisation. He took from a small cooperative through to a big multinational company. Organisational change. I've tried to keep it a very simple definition. It's the way we do things around here. I'm going to leave a copy of this PowerPoint with the department so if you can get from it. So what's culture shown by? Behaviours. We'll talk about how you motivate and persuade people, how you handle people. The language used. Language is very important. Thing of culture. Quite often when you go into organisations, they talk in double Dutch too because their language is different, have different meanings. Types of relationships, formal, informal. I have a new client, I always go to their offices at least half an hour before my appointment. I walk through the car park to see what type of cars they drive. Do they have allocated car park slots for different positions? When you sit down in the reception area, how you're treated by the receptionist. Whether the magazines, like one organisation I went to had 1940 magazines there. That's a pretty strong indication of where their thinking was. How do people walk around? Are they all dressed up or casual? Are they laughing a lot or all security conscious? All those things give you an idea. They're what they call the artefacts of a culture. Types of relationships are important. It's the informal relationships that get things done. And if I've got time, we'll have a look at a tool which helps you look at the informal organisation. You know who in your organisation will make things happen, but he or she mightn't have the big title. If they say yes, it happens. If they say no, it doesn't happen. I've done for 10 years work as a consultant at Boeing in Australia, and the real power lays with the PEs and PAs. If you've got one of them offside, you're in big trouble. You can get the managers offside, no problem. So they are the informal leaders. You have to keep them on side. The identity displays, which are things like uniform and logos, they will give you an idea of the culture. And then you've got the values they talk about, but also the values they actually do, and they're reflected in behaviours. Because there's a lot of talking of values, and you walk around offices and see them printed up on the wall and so on. There ain't too much doing it. I was working with one of your well-known trading organisations, and I asked the people to quote me their organisation's values in a session, and even the directors couldn't name them all. So straight away knew it was just a lot of talk, and there was no follow-up. And then we talk about assumptions, mindsets, etc. We'll be revisiting these as we go through. So most organisation cultures are like an iceberg. There's two parts to it. There's the tangible part, and then there's the intangible. And the intangibles, if you think of the iceberg analogy, is basically the underground stuff. And it's the one hardest to find out about. If you really want to understand organisation culture, you've got to go and talk to the old timers, people who've been there a long time. Find out the heroes, the anti-heroes. In one organisation that was very unionised in Australia, and they kept talking about this guy called Scabby Wilson. And if you call it a scab in Australia, it means across the picket line. And I kept always referring to Scabby Wilson. And I was working with them in 2002. And I said, when did that happen? I said, 1956. So nearly 50 years later, and most of the guys who I talked to would never have met him. He was still very much in the folklore, in a negative way for a lot of the people. So the tangible stuff, which is the easy stuff, the visible stuff, easy to measure, but below the waterline is most of the iceberg, and that's the hard stuff. They're incorrectly named. It should be called the hard stuff should be called the soft stuff, and the soft stuff should be called hard, because the soft stuff that we talk about, the soft skills, are the hard ones to get right. Okay, when you're looking at a culture, these are some of the ways you can look at cultures. This is based on a work by, I think, Hofstein, I think I'm pronouncing the name correctly. He looked at IBM around the world and assumed that the organisation culture was the same. The only difference was the country's culture. And he came up with these 6 or 5 basic headings of culture. How do you look at the relations of individuals to groups, the in-group and the outer-group, the gender roles in organisations, and that's obviously one that's in a state of flux in many areas. Relationships and attitudes to authority, tolerance of the unknown, and attitudes to time, etc. Long-term versus short-term. So that's quite a good one to look at a culture. There's some examples of cultural differences. I'll let you read those rather than me try and summarise them. And again, they're generalisations. You can think of people who don't fit those. And some of you can read faster than I can speak, so that's... Anyone like to make any comment on those? Do you think they're right or disagree with them? Where would you put Fiji's culture in there? Anywhere in there? No answer, so you're allowed to talk, air goes up through your lungs, across your voice, vocal cords, and noise comes out your mouth, and that's just how you're talking. Well, I'll get you to do an exercise in a moment. I would think you're probably, to me, more in the Asian range. It's a generalisation, but I mean, that's very, very general. I've just been doing some work with Vodafone, and they're, and also the housing authorities, and they've both had dealings with Chinese, but both had very different experiences. It's quite fascinating to hear the two different experiences. One had a very good dealing, the other had a very bad dealing. So it's quite fascinating to hear them talk about it. Okay, and a bit more on that, which I'll let you read at the same time. Let's talk about America and also about India. And I mean, these are fairly, some people say provocative statements, but I think there's an element of fact behind them and like good discussion points. They don't kill me in the rush of your thoughts. Now, I'll break you into groups soon, because I find in Fiji you work a lot better in groups than you do as a big group. They get much more response and so on from you. So we've got an exercise in the moment. And also, the eyes are important, eye contact. I mean, I'm Australian. As a youngster, I taught to shake hands firmly and look the person in the eye. And I gather in Fiji, you can be up for sexual harassment if you do that. So, different. I mean, it's the same with Indigenous people in Australia. They don't look you in the eye, and their handshake's like a wet fish, and so forth. And because you go to some other countries, in Asia, you don't touch people. Like in Thailand, it's all the wires and the way you move your hands, and of course you got the Japanese, etc. So they're interesting things. And I mean, in the West, if you don't look somebody in the eye, they assume you might be lying. You're not really showing them respect, etc. That's different in your culture. Jump on me if I'm wrong. Okay, so the three, culture is very complex, powerful, deep and stable. You can break it into three parts: behaviours, symbols and systems. Important point I want to get across: cultures are held by groups, not by individuals, and we'll just revisit this in a moment. By sending out questionnaires to individuals, you don't get a feeling for their culture. You've got to put people into groups. Okay, forming the groups of about six people. I'm going to make you self-organised, not no more than 6 or 7, and discuss amongst yourselves what makes Fiji unique. What's the cultural uniqueness of Fiji that's also reflected in your organisations? So if I was an outsider coming here, what I have to be aware of, or I was bringing you a framework from America or Australia to do change, what are the cultural issues I'd have to be wary of? Now, I've given you a few slides beforehand to try and prompt a few discussions. So form into groups. Some of the groups at the back are about 6 anyway, but that are self-organising into your groups, about 6 people, and talk about yourself, select a leader to...
Everyone, good evening. Our group here, what makes Fiji unique? I think the first one that we had mentioned is just the powerful networking that we have. In our culture, in Fiji, it's who you know and not what you know. That's something that we found very unique for us in terms of just getting to know our neighbours. I believe that it's due to the communal relationship that we have. Also, Fijians are very accommodative as well in terms of decision makings and the things that we do to host or work with other people. Very hospitable. One thing as well in terms of our language is the mbula. This is a word that is well known, I believe, across globally. And so that is something as well the group can mention in terms of the types of the language that we have as well. Having a grog city setting as well, and just again over grog decisions are made as well over that. And yeah, the other one, the last one that we have here is about the just Fiji time. I believe that this is across the Pacific as well. Just having our own time that drives us as well. Fiji.
Thank you. Just on that Fiji time, I think I found partly an answer, which running these sessions, and I offer people breakfast. And in the Solomons, everyone turned up. We actually started the workshop early. Fiji, most people turned up early, and we started on time. But maybe rather than, this is a case of rather than punishment, being late is given reward for coming early. So hot bread think I'm fantastic.
Good evening, everyone. Basically, our group, we had raised similar points as the previous group, but one thing that was discussed at length was how very traditional our culture can be, and it is shown in the workplace where sometimes there is a reluctance to accept change. People are more akin to doing what has always been done, and they would look at people who have been in an organization for a long period of time, look on them for guidance in trying to get things done. And from that, they would build teamwork in order to get things done. But experience is something that we found that counts in a lot of organizations. Thank you.
We have similar thoughts.